These are the ruins of the Cross and Axe Castle, officially known as Krzyżtopór. It had a Colosseum-like theater, a sprawling underground horse stable, and a ballroom, once so exquisite that nobles from across Europe traveled here to be a part of its social spotlight. Though beyond the ballroom was something that local lore claims to have been even more unusual for the time: a library with a glass floor aquarium. The theorized design wasn't just decorative, it allowed light to pass freely between two levels, while guests, whether in the library above or the dining chamber below, could watch fish glide through this extraordinary medieval fish aquarium. Generally speaking, this was a very important stronghold. In fact, for a brief moment of the 17th century, this was the largest private residence in Europe. Yet now, it's little more than a forgotten monument to one man's wealth. As within a generation, the family was gone, and the estate was looted and abandoned. So how did this castle come to be, and just how did it fall? Stay tuned to find out as we discover what's inside the castle. The story of Krzyżtopór begins with a nobleman whose fortune was built on the logistics of war. His name was Krzysztof Ossoliński, a Polish statesman, scholar, and soldier who rose to the rank of governor of a nearby province during the height of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For context, the Commonwealth was a vast dual monarchy that joined Poland and Lithuania under one crown, a powerful European superstate that thrived on trade, culture, and constant warfare. And in that context, the Ossoliński family was one of the wealthiest, if not most influential lineages of the time, and they left behind several prestigious residences: a grand palace in Warsaw, their ancestral seat, and a Baroque residence. As for the nobleman Krzysztof himself, he was educated across Europe, from Krakow to Paris and Rome, where he encountered and embraced Renaissance ideals: symmetry, reason, faith, and grandeur. So when he returned home, he wanted to leave behind a legacy that conveyed those convictions and outshined every other palace in his kingdom. As money was no object, it didn't take long before a grand castle began to rise. But where did he get all that money from? Well, since Krzysztof held lucrative royal contracts to supply the army with food and materials, he earned a fortune in what we'd now call military logistics. He also married 3 times. Each alliance brought with it an enormous dowry, expanding his fortune. Now, this was common practice in 17th century Europe. Surprisingly, noblemen often increased their fortunes through marriage, the dowry, consisting of the wealth or property provided by a bride's family, could fund estates, grand construction projects, or even political advancement. In other words, who you married was directly crucial to your status. Anyhow, he played the game well, purchased a rocky hill near the town of Opatów, and began work on a castle that would embody his personal creed, the unity of faith and power. He called it Krzyżtopór, Cross and Axe. The words were taken from symbols found within his coat of arms. Together, they represented 2 forces he believed ruled his life: religion and combat. And it needs to be said, these ambitions were extraordinary, especially by 17th century standards. For the residence was to be part fortress, part temple, and part calendar, with 365 windows for the days of the year, 52 rooms for the weeks, and 4 massive towers for the seasons. Though we don't really know how he accomplished the construction itself. Those details remain a mystery, as most of the original records were lost in the wars that followed. Hence, for centuries, historians knew who funded the castle, but not who designed it. However, some of those facts recently surfaced, and the only reason we know who oversaw construction is kind of thanks to blind luck. Basically, a historian from Krakow discovered a property record mentioning a man named X. Chel, listed as, quote, the head of construction for Krzyżtopór Castle in Krakow. And apparently, the builder's proceeds from the project were so substantial that he was able to build an entire tenement house in Krakow. Though, beyond that, history leaves us with little more than educated guesses about how this all came to be. When the castle was finally completed, visitors would have entered through the main gate, a ceremonial threshold to one of the grandest private estates ever built. From here, they followed a precise path through the property, each turn revealing yet another display of status. Beyond the gate, the path splits in two, and this is very interesting, as ramp tunnels running left and right led to the castle's most surprising feature, an underground stable system. Down here, horses were kept in a level of luxury that few people on Earth enjoyed at the time. Apparently, they were fed through marble troughs, surrounded by mirrors so that the chambers appeared vast and cared for around the clock. Furthermore, this underground space was vast enough to accommodate full carriages for the castle's owner, his family, and the numerous guests who would travel here for social functions. But that's just the beginning, since some tunnels ran deep, far beyond the stables, into places like wine cellars, storage rooms, and even a channel leading to the castle's spring-fed well, a feature that proved to be an engineering marvel and, ironically, a vulnerability. But more on that in a moment. So, to recap, the elite would cross a moat, arrive via the front gate, and their horse carriages, along with the bad smells they carried, would just disappear into an underground chamber as the nobles walked towards the entry gallery. The twin galleries were long marble halls, lined with portraits, sculptures, and trophies from across the world. This was the aristocratic ritual of arrival. Think of it as something like 17th century flexing. Every guest had to pass through these corridors, absorbing a simple message. The Ossolinskis had everything: money, education, and divine favor. And by the time that message sank in, the guests would be stepping into the heart of the castle, the grand ballroom. This ballroom stretched across two levels, a dance floor below and a balcony above. From that vantage point, the elite could observe the spectacle, address their guests, or simply be seen. And this particular room would have been drenched in sunlight, with windows so large that they contrasted the castle's defense capabilities. Beyond the ballroom was the octagonal tower, the jewel of the estate. It's here that we find the most remarkable chamber and legend of all, the library with that glass floor and aquarium beneath it. If true, the design was pure Renaissance genius, allowing sunlight to pass through the water and fill both levels with rippling light. Theoretically, guests could have stood among the books or dined in the chamber below as they observed the majesty of aquarium life. However, to understand this chamber, we need to trace the origins of the legend. It first appeared not in 17th century documents, but in 19th century travel notes, written by visitors exploring the already ruined castle. They described, quote, a transparent floor and, quote, a water basin beneath the library. These notes blend observation with the romantic imagination of the era. And the romance was exacerbated as local guides repeated the story for generations. And by the early 1900s, it had already become part of the castle's identity. But academically, the claim doesn't exactly hold up. We have no documents mentioning an aquarium. And the water system, which is well understood, was built for things like fountains, kitchens, and stables, not maintaining ornamental fish aquariums. So, while it's not entirely impossible, the aquarium remains unproven, yet it's a fun side story. Now let's move on to the center of it all, a Colosseum-style theater. This space is interesting, as from above, it formed a perfect key. A circular theater as the handle, the ballroom as its stem, and the galleries as open wings. Astonishingly, it's one of very few structures to present this type of symbolism outside of Rome. And I also need to emphasize that this theater was located inside the castle, not in the open air. In other words, it was part of a surprisingly advanced network of systems that made this 17th century residence unusually comfortable. For example, the castle had central heating, so the marble floors in the representative chambers were warm. There was also a sophisticated ventilation system, refined enough to bring in fresh air while keeping kitchen smells out of the living quarters. But there was other surprising technology. For example, several hand-cranked lifts were strategically placed so that food and supplies could be moved quickly between floors with minimal disruption to the household. Even the castle's primitive plumbing offered a more dignified alternative to what most people did in that era. I'm talking about tossing their waste out the window. Every detail was deliberate. Even the staircases were divided. One set for servants, which was narrow and utilitarian, and another, grand and symbolic, for the nobles. But what fascinated me most is the natural water spring hidden deep beneath the castle. That spring became the foundation for the entire design. You see, water was drawn upward into a central holding tank, which was also fitted with spillways to prevent flooding. From there, it flowed outward through a series of fountains and ornamental ponds in the gardens, a self-sustaining system that still works to this day. In fact, according to our local guide, even in the driest summer months, these old pools are never empty. And it's a good thing, since beyond their function, they also made for perfect garden decorations. Historical records indicate that the castle was surrounded by Italian-style formal gardens to its north. These were expansive geometric gardens that blended Renaissance symmetry and French influences, covering more than 1.5 hectares, although they look much different today, having been lost to time, war, and neglect. Not unlike the rest of the castle, only outlines remain. And at this point, you're probably starting to wonder where it all went wrong. The first step towards the downfall occurred when Krzysztof Ossoliński unexpectedly died on February the 24th, 1645, in Krakow, barely a year after his dream had come to fruition. He was approximately 57 at the time. Contemporary accounts offer no apparent cause of death, though some suggest a natural or stress-related illness. He was buried in a monastery far away from the grand residence that defined his life. His son, Krzysztof Baldwin Ossoliński, inherited the castle but died just 4 years later in battle, and with that, the family line ended forever, and their monument was headed towards a similar fate. In 1655, Sweden invaded Poland in one of the most catastrophic campaigns of the 17th century. Cities were burned, populations scattered, and noble estates like this were stripped bare. The Swedish army didn't just take weapons, they looted art, furniture, sculptures, and even the marble floor. So naturally, everything of value was loaded onto wagons and shipped north. We don't know the exact fate of these items, but many objects likely ended up in Swedish palaces or museums, while others vanished into private collections. To this day, many Polish historians believe that fragments of the castle, like statues, carved columns, manuscripts, and so on, still sit mislabeled in Swedish archives. And as it's now a matter between governments, ordinary citizens like us will never really know the truth about what might or might not be in Sweden's archives. Though, to be fair, what came next was far worse. Centuries later, Russia came in and finished the job with fire. And once they were done, little more than rubble remained. So, when I look at this castle, I can't help but think that if anything is permanent in this world, it's lineage, because without that, even the greatest monuments cannot survive.